I'm Sarah, and I'm 31 years old. For most of my life, I believed that love meant sacrifice, that being the responsible one meant carrying burdens others couldn't handle, and that family meant accepting whatever treatment they decided you deserved. But what happened when my brother finally moved out at 25 changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my worth, and what I was willing to accept. If you've ever felt like the family's scapegoat, the one who had to grow up too fast while watching others get endless second chances, this story is for you. And please, stay until the end, because what my parents discovered about my life will completely change how you think about proving your worth to people who should have seen it all along. Let me take you back to where this all started, when I was 16 and my brother Jake was 18. Our family lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in suburban Ohio, and my parents, both working middle-class jobs, always claimed money was tight. My mom worked as a nurse, pulling long shifts at the local hospital, and my dad managed a small auto parts store. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they weren't struggling either. The day my mom sat me down at our kitchen table and explained that I would need to start paying rent was a Tuesday in March. I remember because I had just gotten home from my part-time job at the local grocery store, still wearing my uniform, exhausted from a 6-hour shift after school. She told me that since I was working now and 16 was old enough to contribute to the household, fairness meant I should pay $300 a month for my room and board. $300 doesn't sound like much now, but when you're making minimum wage at $7.25 an hour, working maybe 20 hours a week because of school restrictions, that was more than half my monthly income. I asked about Jake, who was 2 years older, worked full-time at a warehouse, and definitely made more money than I did. My mom explained that Jake was saving for college and his future, so it wouldn't be fair to burden him with expenses when he was being so responsible with his money. Even at 16, something about that reasoning felt wrong, but I trusted my parents. I believed they knew what was best, that they were teaching me responsibility and preparing me for adulthood. So I started paying rent, carefully budgeting my small paychecks, setting aside $65 from each week's earnings, often working extra hours on weekends to make sure I had enough. What I didn't know then was that Jake wasn't saving for college at all. He was spending his money on a brand new truck, going out with friends every weekend, buying expensive clothes and electronics. While I was counting quarters to make sure I could afford lunch at school, he was living completely free, treated like a guest in his own home rather than a contributor to household expenses. The pattern continued through my junior and senior years of high school. I maintained my job, paid my rent religiously, never missed a payment, and somehow still managed to keep my grades up enough to qualify for academic scholarships. My parents often praised me for being so mature and responsible, but that praise always came with an undertone of expectation, as if my reliability was simply the baseline they expected rather than something worthy of recognition. Meanwhile, Jake's lifestyle became increasingly lavish. He traded up to an even newer truck, started dating a girl whose parents were wealthy, and began spending money on things like expensive dinners and weekend trips. When I asked my parents how he could afford all this while saving for college, they told me he was just good with money and that I shouldn't worry about his finances. When graduation approached and college acceptance letters started arriving, the disparity in our situations became even more obvious. I had worked incredibly hard to earn a partial academic scholarship to the state university, covering about 60% of my tuition. I had also been working extra shifts all senior year to save money for the remaining costs, living off peanut butter sandwiches and ramen noodles to stretch every dollar. Jake, on the other hand, announced that he had decided college wasn't for him right now. He wanted to keep working and enjoy his freedom for a few more years. My parents accepted this decision without question, even though it meant all that money he was supposedly saving for his education could now be spent on whatever he wanted. The conversation about my own college expenses was much different. My parents sat me down and explained that while they were proud of my scholarship, they couldn't help with the remaining costs. They had their own financial responsibilities, and since I had proven myself so capable of earning money and managing expenses, they knew I could handle funding my education independently. I remember feeling like I had been punched in the stomach. Here I was, the one who had been paying rent since 16, working constantly, maintaining good grades, earning scholarships through my own efforts, and yet I was the one who would have to take out loans and work multiple jobs to afford college. Jake, who had lived completely free and spent his money frivolously, was being supported without question in his decision to avoid the financial responsibilities of higher education. But I did it anyway. I took out student loans, worked 2 jobs while attending classes full-time, and somehow managed to graduate with my degree in accounting in 4 years. During those college years, I rarely came home, partially because I was so busy with work and school, but also because seeing Jake still living in his childhood bedroom, still contributing nothing to household expenses, still being treated like the favored son, was too painful to witness regularly. Jake continued living at home through his early 20s, and every time I visited, his situation remained the same. No rent, no contributions to groceries or utilities, no expectations of independence or responsibility. My parents continued to treat this arrangement as perfectly normal, even as Jake approached 25 and showed no signs of wanting to move out or take on adult responsibilities. Meanwhile, I had built an independent life for myself. I graduated college, found a good job at a regional accounting firm, moved into my own apartment, and was steadily paying down my student loans while building a career. My parents occasionally mentioned how proud they were of my success, but it always felt hollow, like they were taking credit for raising such an independent daughter, while completely ignoring the fact that their differential treatment had forced that independence upon me. The real breaking point came when I was 26 and Jake was 28. I had been working as a certified public accountant for 3 years, had been promoted twice, and was making a comfortable salary. Jake was still living at home, still working the same warehouse job he had started at 18, and still contributing nothing to household expenses. During a family dinner, the conversation turned to finances and the cost of living. My parents complained about how expensive everything had become, how hard it was to make ends meet on their salaries. They mentioned struggling with the mortgage payment and some unexpected car repairs that had strained their budget. I listened to this conversation with growing frustration, watching Jake remain completely silent while my parents discussed their financial stress. Finally, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I pointed out that they had an adult son living in their home who could certainly contribute to expenses, especially if money was becoming an issue. The response was immediate and harsh. My mother told me it wasn't my place to judge their family arrangements. My father said that Jake was still finding himself and didn't need the pressure of additional expenses while he was figuring out his path in life. They both made it clear that my suggestion was inappropriate and that I should focus on my own life rather than interfering in decisions that didn't concern me. But what hurt most was Jake's reaction. He looked directly at me and said that just because I had always been money-obsessed and willing to pay my way didn't mean everyone else should be forced to live that way. He suggested that maybe I had volunteered to pay rent as a teenager because I wanted to feel superior, and that my current financial situation didn't give me the right to dictate how other people should live. I left that dinner feeling like I had been slapped. Here was my family, reframing my years of responsibility and financial contribution as character flaws, as evidence that I was somehow selfish or controlling. They had turned my willingness to work hard and contribute to the household into a negative trait, while Jake's complete dependence was framed as a healthy, pressure-free approach to young adulthood. That night, I went home and really examined my relationship with my family for the first time. I started keeping track of the patterns I had been noticing but never fully acknowledged. I documented the different standards, the different expectations, the way my achievements were minimized while Jake's lack of responsibility was excused. I realized that I had been paying rent since 16, not because it was fair or because it would teach me responsibility, but because my parents knew I would comply. They knew I was the reliable one who wouldn't push back, who would work harder to meet whatever expectations they set. Jake, on the other hand, had learned early that he could resist expectations and still be supported, that his comfort and freedom were priorities worth protecting. Over the next year, I started setting small boundaries. I stopped offering to help with family financial emergencies. When my parents mentioned struggling with bills, I remained sympathetic but didn't volunteer solutions or assistance. I continued attending family gatherings but limited my visits and kept conversations surface level. The real test came when I was 28 and received an unexpected opportunity. My firm was opening a new office in Denver, and they offered me a senior position with a significant salary increase and the chance to help build the practice from the ground up. It was an incredible career opportunity, but it meant moving across the country from my family. When I announced my decision to take the position, my parents' reaction was immediate and intense. They couldn't understand why I would move so far away from family, why I would prioritize career advancement over staying close to the people who loved me. They questioned whether the money was really worth being isolated from my support system. But their real panic became obvious when they started discussing the practical implications of my move. My mother mentioned that they had been hoping I might be able to help them with some upcoming expenses. My father brought up that they had been considering asking me to co-sign on a loan for some home improvements. They had been counting on my financial stability and success to help support their lifestyle, even while they continued to fully support Jake without question. Jake's reaction was different but equally revealing. He seemed genuinely surprised that I would make such a major life decision without considering how it would affect the family. He pointed out that I had always been the stable one, the one they could count on, and that moving away felt like I was abandoning my responsibilities to the people who had shaped me into the successful person I had become. That last comment was what finally broke something open inside me. Jake was claiming that my family had shaped my success, when the reality was that their differential treatment had forced me to become self-reliant and driven. They were trying to take credit for the strength and independence that had developed specifically because I couldn't depend on their support. I took the job in Denver, and the move was everything I had hoped it would be professionally. I thrived in the new environment, built strong relationships with colleagues and clients, and was promoted to partner within 2 years. I bought a beautiful house, traveled, and created a life that reflected my values and interests rather than obligations and expectations. During this time, my contact with my family was limited but civil. I called regularly, visited during major holidays, and maintained the surface-level relationship they seemed comfortable with. But I stopped trying to bridge the deeper disconnection, stopped hoping they would recognize the inequality in how they had treated Jake and me. The situation finally came to a head when I was 30 and Jake was 32. He had finally moved out of my parents' house, but only because he had gotten married and his wife insisted on having their own place. However, even after moving out, my parents continued to provide financial support, helping with their rent, groceries, and various expenses. Around the same time, my accounting firm was featured in a major business magazine as one of the fastest-growing practices in the region. The article included a substantial section about my role in the firm's success, highlighting my client relationships, my strategic thinking, and my leadership in developing new service offerings. It was the kind of professional recognition that represented years of hard work and expertise. When the magazine came out, I received congratulations from colleagues, clients, and friends. My parents called to say they had seen the article and were proud, but their response felt perfunctory, like they were checking off a box rather than celebrating a significant achievement. A few weeks later, I learned through a mutual friend that my parents had been showing the magazine article to their neighbors and acquaintances, taking pride in having raised such a successful daughter. They were using my achievements as social currency while having never actually acknowledged the hard work and sacrifice that had made those achievements possible. But the real revelation came during a family gathering that summer. Jake and his wife were having financial difficulties, struggling with credit card debt and unable to make their car payments. My parents were discussing ways to help them, considering options like refinancing their own home to provide Jake with a loan, or even having Jake and his wife move back in temporarily to help them get back on their feet. During this conversation, my mother mentioned that it was unfortunate that not everyone could be as naturally good with money as I was. She suggested that my financial stability was just a personality trait, like being artistic or athletic, rather than the result of years of forced responsibility and careful budgeting. That comment revealed something I had been trying to understand for years. My parents had rewritten the history of our family dynamics to make themselves feel better about the differential treatment. In their version of events, they hadn't forced responsibility on me while protecting Jake from expectations. Instead, I was naturally responsible and money-focused, while Jake was naturally free-spirited and needed more support to find his way. They had erased the fact that I had been paying rent since 16, while Jake lived free until 25. They had forgotten that I had worked multiple jobs to put myself through college while they supported his decision to avoid higher education. They had minimized the reality that I had built my career and financial stability without family support, while they continued to subsidize Jake's lifestyle well into his 30s. I realized that I would never receive acknowledgement or apology for the inequality I had experienced because they had convinced themselves that inequality had never existed. They had created a narrative where different treatment was actually fair treatment, where my independence was natural rather than necessary, and where their ongoing support of Jake was nurturing rather than enabling. That understanding was both devastating and liberating. It was devastating because it meant giving up the hope that my family would ever truly see or acknowledge what had happened. But it was liberating because it freed me from the obligation to keep trying to make them understand, to keep hoping for recognition that would never come. I made the decision to stop participating in family financial discussions and to set clear boundaries around my own involvement in family financial situations. When my parents asked for advice about helping Jake, I politely redirected the conversation. When they mentioned their own financial concerns, I expressed appropriate sympathy but didn't offer solutions or assistance. The change in my behavior was noticed immediately. My parents began questioning why I was being so distant, why I wasn't more involved in family problem-solving the way I used to be. They seemed genuinely confused that I was no longer volunteering to help with situations that involved the same dynamics that had affected me for years. Jake's reaction was more direct. He confronted me during a family visit, telling me that my attitude had changed and that I seemed to think I was better than the rest of the family. He pointed out that my financial success didn't give me the right to judge other people's situations or to withhold support from family members who needed help. That conversation was when I finally said what I had been thinking for years. I told Jake about the rent I had paid since 16 while he lived free. I explained about working multiple jobs through college while our parents supported his decision to avoid educational expenses. I described building my career without family financial support while watching him receive ongoing subsidies well into his 30s. His response was telling. He didn't deny any of the facts I presented, but he reframed them in ways that minimized their significance. He said that I had chosen to be so focused on money and work that I had volunteered for responsibilities that no one had forced on me. He suggested that my success proved that their approach had worked, that I had turned out fine despite or perhaps because of the independence I had been given. But most revealing was his admission that he had always assumed I preferred the arrangement. He said he thought I liked being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who had everything figured out. He had never considered that I might have wanted the same freedom and support that he had received, because I had never complained or demanded equal treatment. That conversation helped me understand that the problem wasn't just differential treatment, but a family system that had assigned us roles early and never questioned whether those roles were fair or healthy. I had been cast as the independent, capable one who didn't need support, while Jake had been cast as the one who needed protection and assistance. These roles had become so entrenched that even pointing out the inequality was seen as inappropriate or ungrateful. Over the following months, I continued to maintain boundaries while observing how my family responded to my changed behavior. What I discovered was that my role as the reliable, helpful family member had been more central to family functioning than I had realized. My parents had grown accustomed to having me as a resource for problem-solving and potential financial assistance. Jake had come to expect that I would always be available to provide advice or support when needed. When I stepped back from that role, the family dynamic shifted in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. My parents had to confront their financial decisions without the safety net of my potential involvement. Jake had to navigate his difficulties without the expectation that I would provide guidance or assistance. The real turning point came when my accounting firm was acquired by a national company, and I was offered a position as regional director with a substantial salary increase and equity stake in the new organization. The professional recognition and financial compensation represented the culmination of years of strategic career building and expertise development. When I shared this news with my family, their reaction was mixed. They expressed pride in my achievement, but there was also an undertone of resentment or discomfort with my continued success. My mother made a comment about how some people have all the luck, while my father wondered aloud whether corporate success was really worth the stress and responsibility that came with it. But Jake's response was the most honest. He admitted that my continued professional advancement made him feel bad about his own career situation. He said that having a sister who was so successful put pressure on him to achieve more than he was comfortable with, and that my independence made him feel like he was being judged for needing more family support. That admission helped me understand something important about family dynamics and differential treatment. Jake hadn't just benefited from the unequal expectations, he had also been harmed by them. While I had been forced to develop independence and resilience, he had been prevented from developing those same qualities. While I had been expected to figure things out on my own, he had been taught to depend on others for support and guidance. Neither of us had been served well by the family system that treated us so differently. I had been forced to grow up too fast and shoulder responsibilities that should have been shared more equally. He had been protected from challenges that might have helped him develop confidence and capabilities. But understanding the broader dysfunction didn't change the fact that I needed to protect myself from continued participation in that system. I had worked too hard to build a healthy, independent life to allow family dynamics to undermine my emotional and financial well-being. I decided to have one final conversation with my parents about the patterns I had observed and the boundaries I needed to maintain. I explained that I loved them and wanted to have a relationship with them, but that relationship needed to be based on mutual respect rather than unexamined expectations. I told them about the impact of paying rent since 16 while Jake lived free, about funding my education while they supported his decision to avoid those costs, about building my career without family support while watching them continue to subsidize his lifestyle. I explained that I wasn't asking them to change their relationship with Jake, but I needed them to understand why I couldn't continue to be available for financial assistance or advice while they maintained such different standards for their children. Their response was defensive and dismissive. They insisted that they had always treated us fairly, just differently according to our personalities and needs. They said that I had always been strong and capable, so they had given me the independence I seemed to want. They claimed that Jake needed more support because he was different, not because they loved him more or valued him more highly. They couldn't or wouldn't see that their different treatment had created the very personality differences they were using to justify that treatment. They couldn't acknowledge that my strength and capability had developed partly as a survival mechanism in response to having to be self-reliant from a young age. The conversation ended with my parents expressing hurt that I was punishing them for doing their best as parents, and me trying to explain that setting boundaries wasn't punishment, but self-preservation. We reached an impasse where they wanted me to accept their version of family history, while I needed them to acknowledge the reality of my experience. In the 3 years since that conversation, I have maintained a cordial but distant relationship with my family. I attend major holidays and celebrate important milestones, but I don't participate in financial discussions or offer assistance with family problems. I have built a life that reflects my values and priorities rather than obligations and expectations that were never equally applied. Jake and his wife eventually moved back in with my parents after falling behind on their rent and credit card payments. My parents refinanced their home to help pay off his debts and are now supporting not just Jake but his family as well. They have never asked me for financial assistance, perhaps understanding that my boundaries are firm, or perhaps recognizing that asking would highlight the very inequalities they prefer not to acknowledge. My career has continued to flourish. I was recently promoted to managing partner of our regional office, overseeing a team of 15 accountants and serving clients throughout the Mountain West region. I have been featured in several more business publications and have spoken at professional conferences about practice management and client relations. More importantly, I have built relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocity. I have friends who value my friendship rather than my reliability, romantic relationships where support flows both ways, and professional relationships where my contributions are recognized and valued. The hardest part of this journey has been letting go of the hope that my family would eventually see and acknowledge what happened. There's a part of me that still wishes my parents would recognize the inequality in how they treated Jake and me, that they would understand the impact of forcing independence on one child while protecting another from responsibility. But I've learned that waiting for that acknowledgement would mean staying stuck in a dynamic that never served my well-being. I've learned that my worth isn't determined by whether my family can see it, that my success isn't diminished by their inability to properly credit the work that created it. I've also learned that setting boundaries isn't about punishment or revenge, but about protecting the life you've worked hard to build. I still love my family, but I love myself enough to refuse to participate in dynamics that undermine my emotional and financial health. For anyone who has experienced similar family dynamics, I want you to know that your perception of unfairness is probably accurate. Families often gaslight children into believing that differential treatment is normal or justified, but equal love should mean relatively equal expectations and support, adjusted for age and circumstances, but not for arbitrary personality assignments or favoritism. You don't owe your family continued participation in dynamics that harm you, even if they reframe your boundaries as selfishness or ingratitude. You don't have to accept their version of family history if it contradicts your lived experience. And you definitely don't have to prove your worth to people who should have seen it all along. If this story resonated with you, please share your own experiences in the comments. Have you experienced differential treatment in your family? How did you handle the realization that family dynamics were unfair? What boundaries have you had to set to protect your own well-being? And if you found value in this story, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. These conversations about family dynamics and boundary setting are so important, and I'll continue sharing stories that validate experiences that are often minimized or dismissed. You deserve relationships that see and value who you really are.